everyone. Welcome to day 3. Very briefly about me, so Dr. Tom Campbell. I'm an associate professor at Edinburgh Napier University. I work in the School of Applied Sciences up here on our wonderful Sight Hill campus. But I'm also lucky enough, and have been lucky enough over the last decade, to work in the Mountain Bike Centre of Scotland, down in the Tweed Valley, in this much more interesting picture down here. I'm currently the academic lead for sustainability within the Mountain Bike Centre of Scotland, and a lot of my work recently has been kind of centering around sustainability of mountain bike trails themselves, and also kind of sustainability of wider mountain biking communities. So today I'm going to go into the DIRTT project. We're going to look at the survey results. But to ease us in gently, I borrowed some slides from someone who's more creative and graphically minded than myself, just to ease it in gently. So I guess for those of you who don't know what the DIRTT project is, you've obviously not been hanging around Thomas often enough. Yeah, big advocate. Basically, the DIRTT project is what it says up here and what it says down here. It's doing what it says on the tin, really. We're looking at developing, or are and have developed, into European resources for trail builder training. And I think the kind of main aim of the project is very much to ensure the quality of mountain bike trails, to improve the experiences that riders can have on the trails, and doing that through education and training to improve the competence of trail builders, with a key focus on quality and sustainability, and looking at how we can engage and recruit and get the right people into the right roles, and kind of really just professionalise the sector a little bit for a number of reasons. DIRTT project, so where are we now? What's happened so far? Project's been running since 2019. It's an Erasmus Plus funded project. Initially was 3 years, which is this first phase here. I think just shy of 400,000 euros for that first phase. And we've got a multinational pan-European project partnership that has worked to develop the education framework. Now, the very first part of that was to undertake an industry and needs analysis. I think it's really important, and I should probably have prefaced the data that we're going to look at. It's really important that this is not being imposed upon people. DIRTT's very much taking a kind of ground-up approach, or at least ensuring that we're engaging with the trail building sector in developing education. We're not telling you what to do. We want to learn from you guys and use that in developing the education and framework. So the very first thing we did was undertake this needs analysis and rider survey, and that underpinned the syllabus that was developed. We created a knowledge hub, delivered a college course out in Norway, and with practical sessions out in Agder. There's been tutor training delivered, and those tutors have gone back to their own their own countries and delivered national level training. And that's something that DIRTT is also very cognizant of, is that we have a European level framework, but we know that there are national differences, and we need to attend to that context and think about how we can design a framework that is consistent in as far as it needs to be, but really allows that kind of individual nuance of the specific countries to come through. So very briefly, because there's going to be enough on the other survey. The first survey, well, there were 2 surveys. Why do 1 survey when you can do 2, or in fact 3, as the case may be? Thomas once referred to me, actually several times referred to me as the survey guy. I took a little bit of exception to it at the time. I've got over it, and I guess, well, here we are. Turns out he was right. So the first survey, the first part of that was a trail sector survey, and we had 121 respondents from across Europe, and they told us an awful lot about what the training needs were. And allied with that, we decided to survey the riders. It was really important to get the perception of riders. What do they want to have? What are the trails they want to ride? What do they want to see built? These 2 things have to kind of map up. There's no point delivering an excellent quality trail if it's not what people want to ride, because they'll go and build their own stuff, essentially. So yeah, very clear appetite for training, very strong evidence of the potential value or the desire to have certification in there. And we identified loads of specific priority training areas, essentially did a short skills gap analysis. What are you currently able to do? What are you not able to do? Where do we need to start focusing that training and that education? And kind of one of the key learnings for me in there was that free text responses or qualitative questions within surveys are really, really powerful. They're complex, they're difficult to analyze, but they can generate some great data. So that's enough on there. DIRTT 2.0 survey, that's what we're all here for. Everyone came to that conference purely for this. Things we wanted to know: what are the characteristics of the current trail sector? We need to know that. It's really important to understand how these companies are organized, what the size is, what the structure is, a little bit about staff ratios, because all of that really does feed into how you design or what a certification framework looks like. Real focus on sustainable and inclusive trails. What's the knowledge out there at the moment? What does the sector know? And what do they think is most important? And again, what are the training needs? And then moving on to this idea of trying to identify common industry profiles. Because again, that's really important. If we can work out what roles people are fulfilling, it becomes easier, or potentially easier, to map the specific competencies they need and the training that they need. And there were some specific questions around actually a framework itself. What could that look like? What should it look like? How would you like to be re-accredited, for example? Very briefly, it was delivered online in a mobile-friendly format, try and maximize the number of respondents that we could get there. Was only delivered in English. It was ethically approved, always my favorite part of delivering any survey. And we had quite a lot of questions in there. There were 52 in total, but it was designed with skip logic so that you were only answering the kind of questions that you really needed to. And it did have a little bit of qualitative data in there. Right, so let's get into it. Who answered? We got 152 responses to this survey, so that's a kind of a 50% increase on survey one, I think. Representing 21 different European countries, which is really good. Again, the spread of that's it's super broad. We do see higher concentration of respondents, funnily enough, from the countries where we have project partners. That's kind of to be expected. We used a convenient sampling approach whereby we specifically kind of invited people to respond to the survey who we knew were operating in the sector, trusted stakeholders primarily. But a decent spread of respondents. So we found that, interestingly, over 3/4 of people who responded to this were either the owner, co-owner, or had some form of similar leadership or decision-making role within the organization. Almost half of everyone who answered had over a decade of experience within the trail sector, which is great to see. So we have a lot, we do have, I was just having a discussion earlier about this, there's a huge amount of expertise within the sector already. Apologies. We're interested to kind of see what kind of education are people engaging with at the moment. What does that educational level look like? I found it quite interesting to discover that kind of 50% of everyone has actually university level qualification of some sort, and a further 30% has a higher vocational or technical college education. So we can see there's actually a really good level of education within the sector. But then when you ask the question, how relevant is that to your role, you find out actually not really at all. So people are educated, but not specifically in what they're doing as trail builders. 53% not relevant at all. And in fact, only 3% reported it being a role requirement, and 9% that it was completely related. So I think this is kind of pointing again, just reinforcing the fact that there is clearly a need for education, specifically in the roles that people are fulfilling. Okay, so we'll move on. Current state of the sector, what's happening out there? What does it look like? So in terms of characteristics, staff numbers of most organizations, we can see they're generally really small. So the largest proportion here, 44% of all organizations are operating with between 1 and 3 employees, and a further 20% have between 4 and 6 employees. So generally, we're looking at quite small organizations. In terms of the staff roles, that ratio, over 2/3 field-based, and the rest are kind of office and admin, so heavily weighted towards the actual trail builders and people out in the field. And then looking at the organizational structure, we're seeing quite a range in here. So the largest number used paid employees, 33% in there, but we are seeing increasingly voluntary groups and people using a combination of both. Certainly the people who responded to our survey. So what are they doing? We asked what type of trails have been constructed over the last 2 years. 80% of every single person who responded, their organization has built a flow trail in the last 2 years. That's probably not a surprise to anyone. It's useful to get a sense of actually what's happening out there, what type of trail is being constructed. Not so many urban bike parks. We then asked the reason for not constructing following types of trail, so data filtering again, if people selected that they hadn't built a certain type of trail, what was the reason for that? And I think this is quite interesting. For the first 3, almost 4, so downhill tracks, urban bike park, and XC loops, the majority response to those was that there's insufficient demand to build them. So that's kind of fair enough. No one wants it, don't build it. We got a lot of other responses. We did ask for a free text kind of explanation of what that was. We got very limited responses to those, but often it was down to kind of complexity of legislation around a specific type of trail. Not so often was it actually down to a kind of reported lack of knowledge or competence, although we do see some interesting variation and pockets in certain types of trail where there is a bigger gap in knowledge. Pump tracks came out absolutely top of the pops in terms of that lack of knowledge or competence, and we can see again around adapted mountain bike trails, there's a reasonable number of respondents who are saying they didn't have that competence. Move on to sustainability inclusion. What did we find out in here? So we asked people, how would you rate, so self-rated perception of their own knowledge of sustainable trail infrastructure? 8% felt it was extremely good. We've got 39% saying it was somewhat good, and 33% sitting on the fence, neither good nor bad. Don't know who, a couple of people said, yeah, it was extremely bad, but generally speaking, we're getting a kind of, there's some knowledge here, but it's not across the board, it's not perhaps as good as it could be. We certainly want to be seeing more extremely good and getting into a higher proportion of somewhat good, I think would be nice to see. So with that in mind, asking the people how important they felt specific factors are for determining sustainability of a trail and the wider sustainability of that environment. I guess not surprisingly again, water management came out top by quite a margin and avoiding sensitive and wet areas. But there's some stuff in here which I find quite interesting around the ones which got the kind of lowest responses. So the orange lines here, or the ones that I've ordered towards the bottom of this, there's kind of stuff around I guess wider economic development, understanding stakeholders and trail user involvement to optimize the desired experience. That's actually really, really important when we're looking at trail sustainability, is that you're building the right trails for the right people. So some interesting kind of information coming through about the type of stuff that we might start building competencies and learning outcomes around in there. We asked a question around restorative or regenerative potential. Question was actually even longer than this. It was had to provide a little bit of context. Anyway, the idea here being that actually trail building can be like a force for good for the environment. It is possible to build trails in such a way that you're benefiting biodiversity, you can be benefiting animals, you can be creating wildlife corridors. So we wanted to understand how much the sector believed in that at the moment. Almost 2/3 of them said yes, believe that that is possible. We could be going further, we could be doing more, we'd like to go more, like to go further to support that restoration of the environment. Slightly, well, a controversial question, I think, in some ways, was asking whether sometimes we could be looking at building what would be perceived as a less sustainable trail. When we think about just that trail in isolation, do they all need to be built to the same standard? The responses, admittedly, were slightly leading, I guess. But over half of respondents felt that yes, sometimes if you're improving the wider network, or you're improving the local system, or you're bringing benefit to the local economy, or there's some form of wider sustainable benefit, that actually having a trail, which from a construction perspective would appear to be less sustainable, actually that's probably okay. Hardly anyone said sustainability is always more important than the user experience, so quite nice to see that stuff coming through. In terms of inclusion, we asked to what degree people think these characteristics affect how inclusive a certain trail is. Safe and predictable for beginners, quite interestingly came out on the top. Suitable for physically disabled. Some interesting stuff, I think, around kind of accessibility, how easy is it to get to it, what are the safety features, and what are the trailhead amenities. So again, this is just what they're telling us currently they think is important, but it does start giving us some information to go at when we're designing the competencies and the framework. In terms of priority training areas, very clearly being told that they want to know more about how adapted trail guidelines and construction principles can be applied. So how do we go about building that type of trail? And that aligns with what we saw earlier when we looked at the type of trails that were being built or where there was a reported lack of competence. I think there's a clear kind of training need there. And quite encouragingly, something around better insights in the needs and obstacles of different target groups. So how do we actually get them into the riding in the first place? Thinking about that actually before or as part of that trail building process. We then asked, to what extent are you doing this? How much is this embedded within your current practice? Mainly it's happening when specifically requested, or sometimes. And that's understandable. We know that this is a professional organizations working to financial limitations. When customers are asking for things, they will do it. So if a customer exclusively asks for inclusive training, they'll provide that. But I think there's an interesting question in there around how you start changing that narrative, how you start embedding this into, I guess, contracts right at the outset. How do we educate the people asking for trails to know that actually we need to be embedding inclusive thinking within them. Right, moving on to role profiles. Right, we wanted to look at trail roles. So this is really, as I said, this is kind of getting into the crux of it now in terms of working out what can a framework look like? How can we map it against the specific roles that people are performing out there in the field? Ask the question, which of the following aspects of trail development are part of your daily work? Lots of them. See that, yes, actually, the project planning and design, it forms the biggest, or most people reported that as being part of their daily work. But actually, construction is really important. There was lots of trail management, lots of different bits of activity happening. Quite interesting in and of itself. But then when you look at it, we allowed people to report multiple roles in there. And this shows that the largest proportion, 40% of everyone working in the sector, is engaged in multiple roles as part of their daily work. So we're seeing that actually, okay, we're not necessarily, we don't have a kind of industry where people are just planning, just dealing with the construction or the crew management. They're working across all of these different areas. And I suppose that makes sense when we think about what we saw in terms of the size of the organizations. These are often 1 to 3 people or a maximum of 6. So maybe that's the reason for it. Not entirely sure. Like you all to think about that and bring that into the session this afternoon. What is that? Why is that happening? And what are the implications of that for starting to or developing this certification framework? Role titles. Now this is really interesting and really challenging. This goes to the point, the learning from that first survey around the value of asking qualitative open questions and really just trying to get a little bit of a sense check. So rather than asking people to select from a number of predefined roles, we somewhat dangerously asked them to tell us, what is your job? What is it that you're doing out there? Lots of responses. 54 unique role titles were identified. Again, between about a third of respondents when describing their role included multiple roles in there. So we're getting really compelling evidence telling us that people are doing not necessarily everything, but they're doing lots and fulfilling lots of different roles in there. Tried to kind of clean the data a little bit, got rid of duplicates, got rid of terms that appeared to be kind of the same as each other, still leaving us that 54 unique roles. Now in terms of the considerations for how you then analyze the rest of the data, this is pretty difficult. It essentially rules out using role titles as a categorical variable unless we sort all of these into some form of not particularly useful way of looking at role titles. So that's, again, think about that for those of you coming into this afternoon session. I think it's important. We also looked at kind of role autonomy. We provided 5 different descriptions which kind of map against the level of autonomy that people have or could have within the sector. Number 1 being the least, working under supervision, maybe with a little bit of autonomy, and progressing through to highest level of autonomy where people are managing complex technical and professional type roles. And I think the the kind of rationale for considering this or doing this was very much with that framework in mind, seeing if level of autonomy might be a way of mapping against a qualification certification framework, thinking about how often European credits are built up. So that was the purpose of doing that. We did see quite an interesting spread. Again, huge, the highest number of respondents telling us that they had the greatest level of autonomy and responsibility in there. Again, mapping and confirming what we saw in terms of people reporting that earlier on in the survey. So we know that actually lots of people there's lots of people doing lots of roles, and as a result of that, they have roles that have a huge amount of autonomy. Right, so let's get into the real nuts and bolts. We asked around 46 different competencies that were kind of identified through DIRTT 1.0 and asked people to rate these in terms of importance across all aspects of the trail building process. Options being, it's essential, it's very important, somewhat important, or not required. Now, I've ordered this in terms of the highest proportion of respondents to each of those questions. So 61% of them, people told us that actually this is essential. That got the greatest number of respondents. This is kind of good. It's nice to see that actually, yes, the competencies we're asking people about are generally what should be there, or certainly they're telling us they're very important, or actually most of them are essential within these different aspects of the trail building process, which is great, but we wanted to, the whole point of this is to go beyond that and start saying, right, cool, we've got the right competencies, but what do we need for these different roles? We've seen that doing that by role title is very difficult. We've got potential to start looking at that, at least in terms of separating it out by autonomy, which I've tried to do. But I've jumped ahead of myself. Before I do that, this is kind of what it looked like. That's what I'm trying to demonstrate. Generally, across competencies, so this one was construction. That shows you the reds are the highest proportion of respondents. So like 9 out of the 11 or whatever here fell in the essential category. 1 in very important. So there was 1 in somewhat. We're not saying that nobody has told us that things are not required, but we're ordering it by the biggest category of respondents. So when you get in and start trying to look at this by level of autonomy, you're going to have to try and bear with me here. So on this side, what we've done here is group this by the 5 different levels of autonomy, looking at the key competencies within each of those different phases. We do see some interesting kind of variability emerging here. I think certainly looking at what people are telling us at the lowest couple of levels of autonomy compared to the highest. We're seeing in the highest that requirement to define the purpose and need is coming through as being kind of really important. And at those higher levels, interestingly, less kind of focus on some of the stakeholder engagement. But we also took another analytical approach to try and group these levels of autonomy a little bit. So we tried to see, is it possible to maybe split this down into what could be considered as being like a technician level and a manager level. And I did that by grouping the first 2 categories as kind of low technician level autonomy and the top 3 as management. And there is method in this, absolute madness, in that this is kind of an approach that's being employed within America. So it's just, all we're doing here at this point is interrogating the data, trying to make some sense of it and see how we can use that and bring it into the framework. And again, doing this does tell us something. We see a change in the order of priority of competencies when you consider it from a more technician and a more management level approach. So management's much heavier into defining the purpose of the project, and these things move around a little. And I don't want to go into super detail around all of these, but I think it's important just to show you what we're seeing in the data, and then we can discuss whether this is the best way to use it or what we can do getting to this point. Again, planning, quite a lot of variability here. You can see it there visually. I'm not going to talk through them all, but in terms of technician and management, we can see big changes in the order of stuff going on here. Trail plans, the most important for a technician when you order the data this way. For management, not so much. It's interesting. There's stuff going on in the data, definitely, albeit within the limitations of the data that we have. Construction, you can see visually there's differences here. This could be a way to start thinking about how we build that framework. So accepting that there's lots and lots of different roles and different titles, could this approach maybe give us a way to order that makes sense in terms of how we start developing competencies and what people need to know, I guess is the question that we're posing here. Similar findings, just to go briefly through them all. Crew management. This is quite nice in a way in that there's nobody in the lowest level of autonomy telling us that they didn't answer any of this, because they don't have responsibility for crew management. It's to be expected. But again, it's quite nice from a kind of geeky perspective in that the data's there, showing what it should do. Right, so that's kind of almost the end of the data stuff. But I thought it was really important to show you what we're seeing here and what we're trying to do with it. We want to be really transparent with the data that's coming through. And I guess, and be transparent in terms of the thought process and the challenges that exist around how you can take what we see in the data here, how we can then feed that in or start thinking about actually what is the most, how can that map against what the industry currently looks like, the direction it might be going in, rather than just going, well, there's the data, so we're going to do this with it. That's absolutely not what we're doing here. We're just at this kind of point that we're reflecting on it. Briefly then, the last point that we asked explicitly was around certification. I've decided to save you the graphs at this point. I think we've had enough graphs. It's not often I say that. Just summarize the key findings. So certification, we did ask, what's your preferred duration? They had 5 or 6 different options, I think. The highest number of responses were saying sort of 3 to 5, but there was quite a lot of variability in there around whether it should be an annual renewal, 3 to 5 years, up to 10 years. Something to kind of consider and maybe bring into that session as well. In terms of the process for doing it, a really interesting spread with some people looking for actual kind of retraining, going through that structured, organized training process again. Some preferring just a reassessment, just do your assessment again. No need for any additional input, develop your competence that way. And 18% looking at a more portfolio-based approach where they can provide the evidence of what they're doing. I guess, to me, this is really interesting. There's questions around, does it need to be one or the other? Can we do all of these? We're seeing that people have a preference for different methods of gaining that certification. So can that be part of the framework that allows people to choose the one that's most appropriate to them and their organization? We asked some questions around the coordination model, and that was to do with whether it was at a national or European level, different levels of coordination. Almost half of everyone told us they wanted or saw the benefit in having a European coordination, but with a kind of national level application, which I think is really important. In terms of the assessment, not many people were after a purely theoretical based exam, which I think is fair and applies across almost all disciplines. So a combination approach where there's possibly some theory, there's possibly a little bit of a test, or there might be some practical skills assessment, and it kind of maps what we're seeing around that process. So there's a requirement for a bit of flexibility and not just doing things perhaps in one specific way. And I think this probably is the right time to draw upon the wisdom of vanilla ice. I think we have reached the point in the DIRTT project and in the data collection where we really do need to just stop for a moment. We need to take stock of what we have. We need to look at this data. We need to collaborate. And that's the whole purpose of these afternoon sessions. We need to get input from the sector with that data and evidence in mind. This is what's out there. This is what we see. This is what people tell us they want. Does that map with what you guys want? How does that fit? Anyway, the time is now for collaboration. We'll listen to you, and then we'll try and see where we go from there. That's it from me. So thank you. Any questions? I can hang around. Otherwise, I'll get off this stage very quickly.